everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So far in this section of the class, we've talked about emotions and cognitive dissonance. And the rest of this section of the class is going to focus on attitudes and persuasion. So this week we're going to talk about attitudes, about what they are and how they develop and how they are influencing us even if we don't realize that we hold these attitudes. So this week we'll talk about attitudes. Next week we'll talk about persuasion, and so we're going to talk about trying to change people's attitudes. Okay? So you will have an activity this week that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. So let me know if you have any questions about the material. Also, I just want to remind everyone about Exam 4 being the proctored exam. So I sent out an email a little while back with a reminder, but once again, please be thinking about taking this test with an appropriate proctor, so you'll need to make an appointment ahead of time, and just let me know if there are going to be any issues or questions with that as soon as possible. Okay? Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to start talking about attitudes, and so we're going to have to understand what an attitude is and the different components of attitudes, as well as where these attitudes come from. And then next week we'll talk about persuasion, which will be all about changing attitudes. So when we talk about an attitude, it says people are not neutral observers of the world. They evaluate what they encounter and form attitudes. So an attitude is an evaluation of people, objects, ideas, really anything. So probably ever since you've woken up this morning, you've made lots of attitudes, right? You might not have even been aware of them, but maybe you have an attitude about driving the speed limit. Maybe you have an attitude about parking. Maybe you have an attitude about your roommate. Maybe you have an attitude about your job, right? An attitude is just our evaluation of something. Now, the term attitude sometimes has a negative connotation, but we have good attitudes as well as bad attitudes, right? Maybe one person has a certain attitude about a certain television show, that they really, really like it. They have a positive attitude. Someone else can feel very negatively about that television show, right? So we can have an attitude that is a positive evaluation or a negative evaluation. But we form attitudes about everything that we encounter, even if we're not realizing it. So these attitudes are made up of three main components, and these are easy to remember because it's A, B, C, right? A, affective, B, behavioral, C, cognitive. So an affective attitude is an emotional reaction. And so we're going to talk more about these and give plenty of examples, but sometimes our attitudes are based primarily on our emotions. Behavioral is looking to our behavior to help us understand our attitudes, and we'll talk about that. And then a cognitive attitude is one that is based on perhaps logical reasoning, right, thoughts. So as an example, maybe we have attitudes about cars, and I'm not sure how you guys feel about cars, but some people feel very strongly that they like one particular brand more than another, or they like one color of car more than another for some reason, right? Whatever the case may be, if you have an attitude about a car that is affective, it means that you feel some kind of emotional reaction, right? Perhaps the idea of getting a new car is exciting, or perhaps you think about how cool you would look in this car and it just feels right. On the other hand, perhaps there's a certain kind of car that you're not happy about, right? It says, for example, a U.S. auto worker may feel angry and resentful if they see foreign-made cars, right? Because potentially they could view that as a threat to their career. So when we're talking about an affective attitude, it is an evaluation about something that is based on our emotions. A behavioral attitude is one that is based on our behavior, obviously. It's the idea that we see what we're doing and we infer our attitudes from that. So, for example, I keep test driving this car, I must like it, right? Something like that. And we'll talk about more examples later. And then a cognitive reaction, a cognitive attitude, is one that is based on a logical examining of the facts, right? So, for example, maybe you like the hybrid engine or the fuel efficiency or the price. So when you make a cognitive attitude, a cognitive evaluation, you're really thinking logically about the situation. So you can see that perhaps for any one topic, we might have several different kinds of attitudes. So going back to an affectively based attitude, an attitude based more on people's feelings and values rather than their beliefs about the nature of an attitude object. And when I say attitude object, that just means whatever it is that we have the attitude about. So when we're talking about an affectively based attitude, trying to figure out what that might be, one rule of thumb is just think about the topics that are uncomfortable to talk about over dinner with an acquaintance, right? We often have affectively held attitudes about things like politics and religion, things like the death penalty. We can get into this debate because perhaps these things are emotional for us, right? We haven't necessarily sat down and done our research and looked into all of these things. Some of us have, and then we have more of a cognitive attitude. But an affective attitude means that you just have a feeling, either a good feeling or a bad feeling about a particular topic, right? And so a lot of the attitudes that we hold are emotional. It says, for example, sometimes we simply like a car, even if it doesn't make sense, right? So maybe we have all at some point in time made a purchase that didn't make sense. And I hope it wasn't something as large as a car, but maybe we bought something just because we liked it and we had a good feeling about it, but we didn't necessarily take into account, practical things. But sometimes we just simply like it, right? Or this can also go for people as well. Occasionally we feel great about something or someone, even though there might be some reasons to not feel so great, right? So maybe perhaps there are some people that you just have a good feeling about, even though you don't necessarily have proof that you can trust this person or that they're a good person, but you just have a good feeling about them. On the other hand, you could also say, well, I don't have any evidence for it, but I just have a bad feeling about this person, right? That's an affectively based attitudes. Oftentimes, the attitudes that we have affectively based are the ones that are hardest to change, the ones that are hardest to be persuaded about, because we often feel very passionate about these and we're willing to passionately argue them because they're based on emotion. And when you're having a debate that's based on emotion, it's really hard to have a winner, right? Or to say that one side is more correct than the other, right? So affectively based attitudes are very important to us. So if affectively based attitudes don't come from examining facts, and they don't, then where do they come from? When we're talking about examining facts and thinking logically, that's going to be cognitively based, which we'll talk about in a second. Affectively based is not going to come from examining facts. One place it could come from would be your values, right? Whatever that may be. Religious beliefs, if you have religious beliefs, moral beliefs, what you have heard from parents or perhaps from religious leaders or from society in general about what is right and what is wrong often play a role in our affectively based attitudes. Also, sensory reactions. So we like the way something tastes. We like the way something smells, right? You have sensory reactions. An aesthetic reaction is like, wow, that's beautiful. I enjoy looking at that. It's nice. Like, for example, the car. Maybe we just say it's an attractive looking car, right? And then conditioning, which we'll talk more about later, but I don't know how much of a background you have in operant and classical conditioning. We will very lightly touch on those, but affectively based attitudes can come from that as well. Alright, so behaviorally based attitudes. It says an attitude based on observations of how one behaves toward an attitude object. So sometimes we might not always understand how we feel about something, and so we look to our behavior. I don't know if I like this person. Let me see how I'm acting around them. Do I seem angry around them? Do I seem upset? I'm always talking to this person, so maybe I do like them, right? This is like asking someone, how do you feel about exercise? And they say, well, I go to the gym all the time, so I must like it, right? They're looking to their behavior to help them understand their attitudes, right? We don't always realize the attitudes that we hold. Sometimes we have, for example, very negative attitudes about a particular person. We might not even realize it until we notice the way that we act in their presence, right? So this is a behaviorally based attitude. We look to our behavior to help us understand what we're actually feeling. And then cognitively based attitudes are all about logic and reason. An attitude based primarily on people's beliefs about the properties of an attitude object, right? Typically focusing on relevant facts. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about persuasion, but some people just like this cognitive aspect. Some people like doing their research, right? So oftentimes the way to persuade that person is to present them with statistics and facts and that kind of thing, right? Sometimes your attitudes are based primarily on relevant facts. Like, for example, with the car, when you're making a decision about a car, the affective thing is, oh, it feels good when I drive it. I like it. It makes me feel good. The behavioral thing is, well, I've always been test driving it. I've been looking at it. I must like it. The cognitive aspect is it safe, right? Does it have good fuel efficiency? Can I get it for a good price? How long can I drive it? A very practical, pragmatic approach to buying a car. Now, when we talk about making a big decision like buying a car, then we probably think that this cognitive approach is a good one, that we should do our research. We shouldn't make that kind of large decision based just strictly on our emotion. But sometimes we do that, right? So cognitively based attitudes are going to focus on the facts, the statistics. So your activity this week, activity 5, it says think about your attitudes toward politics. Where do they come from? Now, I choose politics because it is political season and because this is a hot button topic right now. Now, what I don't want you to do is tell me your attitude about politics. You can if you want to. I don't really care. You don't have to tell me that. But what I do want you to tell me is your beliefs about politics. Where do they come from, right? Maybe they come from your parents. Maybe they come from doing research. Maybe they come from your peers and so on and so forth. Tell me, where do these attitudes come from? And are they based on affect, behavior, or cognition? And it may be that there's more than one answer here, so tell me as many as there are, right? And then tell me, are you open to changing these attitudes? And if so, what type of argument would be most persuasive? So whatever beliefs that you have about politics, maybe you have a candidate that you like or a position that you like, do you think that someone could persuade you? And if so, how could they persuade you? What kind of argument you think might make you change your mind? Whether it be more of an emotional plea or more of a cognitive, statistics, logical reasoning, right? So I just want to get your thoughts here on where these attitudes come from, how they develop, and how they could be potentially changed. You don't have to tell me your attitude toward any particular candidate or any particular point here. Okay, so this is activity 5. It'll be due by Friday at 5 p.m. All right, so where do our attitudes come from? Because we certainly do have a large number of attitudes. Well, this is probably not a place where you expected to hear the nature-nurture argument, but let me bring it up one more time, right? So nature being your genetic origins, your genes that you were given by your biological parents, and then nurture being what society gives you, the people around you give you, parenting, right? So your parents give you their nature when they give you their genetics, but often if they're the one raising you, they give you your nurture as well. So there is a nature aspect to attitudes. There seems to be some genetic link. It says identical twins share more attitudes than fraternal twins. So we know that identical twins share all of their genetic material, whereas fraternal twins only share half of the genetic material, just like any other sibling pair. And so here we see that individuals who are genetically more alike are more likely to have the same attitudes. And perhaps this is because of things like temperament and personality, right? Perhaps there is something about your temperament or your personality that predisposes you to like a certain candidate or a certain product or whatever the case may be, a certain kind of person, right? And so maybe perhaps your genetics give you your temperament and your personality, which then therefore leads you to like some things more than others, okay? So there is a nature component, but obviously there's a nurture component as well. Your attitudes come from the people that you're around, right? The people that you've been around. And then we're going to talk about some others when we talk about conditioning as a potential place where attitudes come from, but maybe you can think of some other sources of your attitudes here, and you can include these in your activity. So talking about conditioning as a way that we learn attitudes and the way that our attitudes are changed, I'm not going to go too deeply into behavior modification here, but I do want you to just have a little bit of an understanding. So classical conditioning is just the idea that if we have something that already produces some kind of response, right, and we're talking about attitudes, so some kind of emotional response here, is paired with something neutral, often enough, after a while, that thing that was originally neutral will now also produce an emotional response. So originally the neutral thing didn't cause any kind of reaction, but we've learned an association, right? When we talk about classical conditioning, you often hear the example of Pavlov, right? So you hear about the dog where they train them to learn the association between the food and the bell, where food naturally causes a reaction and the bell is neutral, but if we ring the bell and give the food together enough times, then they'll learn that the two go together. The same idea here is that sometimes we have something that naturally causes an emotional response. And then we have something else that's neutral, but if those two things go together often enough, then the neutral stimulus will be able to produce an emotional response, right? So this slide pretty much says what the last one said, but it breaks it down into steps here. So let's think about some examples. A stimulus that elicits an emotional response is paired with a neutral stimulus. So let's say perhaps being with your partner makes you happy, right? Hopefully assuming that your partner makes you happy. So spending time with your partner perhaps is an emotional stimulus. It makes you have that emotional response, right? But then let's say that your partner wants to watch a certain television show. You feel very neutral about the television show. You don't care one way or the other, but your partner wants to watch it. So you sit down with them and have a Netflix marathon, right? How much time can we spend on Netflix? Quite a bit, apparently. But we sit down and have a Netflix marathon with that person. you have a natural emotional reaction to being with your partner. And now this originally neutral stimulus of the television show is being paired with your partner. Over time, if those two things are paired enough, then this neutral stimulus of the television show can cause an emotional reaction, right? You learn that association so that maybe later if you go back and watch the television show without them, you still feel good. It still gives you that emotional reaction, right? Now, this isn't necessarily just a positive thing. Perhaps you had a very negative experience that also taught you a negative emotional reaction, but the idea here is that you just learned an association, and that association changed your attitude toward the television show, for example. So classical conditioning is one type of conditioning that can change or create attitudes. Operant conditioning is the other kind here, and as I said, we're not going to get into any great detail here, but the idea is that behaviors that we freely choose to perform are then reinforced or punished, right? And this says positive, but it could also be negative. I'm not going to talk about the differences in this class, but the idea here is that if you do a certain behavior and it is reinforced, you're more likely to do it again, right? If you do something and someone gives you some kind of praise or some kind of reward, that increases the behavior, right? If you do something and it doesn't work out well and people are mean to you or you get punished or whatever the case may be, then you're less likely to do that behavior again in the future. So really, operant conditioning is just all about rewards and punishments, and reward being another word for reinforcement here. And so sometimes this happens with our attitudes as well, right? Perhaps maybe we say, okay, I'm going to vote for this particular candidate. We tell our friend that we're going to vote for them. And our friend says, yeah, you know what? That's a great idea. I agree with you. Let's talk about why. Now you have been reinforced for saying that you were going to vote for this particular candidate. That will make you more likely to like them and increase your chances that you'll share that information with other people. However, if you tell a friend, I'm going to vote for this candidate, and they react negatively, like, why would you do that? I can't understand that. That doesn't make any sense. They've now punished you. You might be less likely to vote for that candidate, or you're at least less likely to tell other people you're going to vote for that candidate, right? It's punished you, so it has changed your behavior, altered your attitude, right? So operant conditioning, another type of behavior modification. So as we've said then, these freely chosen behaviors, you chose to tell your friend about who you're going to vote for, right? That's something freely chosen behavior will either be increased in the future or decreased because of reinforcement or punishment. So reinforcement is going to increase the behavior, punishment is going to decrease the behavior. Now, when I say increase, what I really mean is that it increases the likelihood, right? And when I say decrease, I mean it decreases the likelihood. It's still possible that even though we were punished for something, we still do it again. We're just less likely. And just because we were rewarded for something doesn't necessarily mean we'll do it again. It just means that we're more likely to do it again, right? So operant conditioning also impacts our attitudes. So another example here, you see for classical conditioning where we're just talking about learning and association. Assuming that you had a good relationship with your grandmother, then maybe visiting your grandmother led to a pleasurable feeling. You enjoyed being with your grandmother, right? Now this is natural. Nobody had to teach you this, assuming you have a good relationship. But maybe perhaps your grandmother's house smells like mothballs, which I don't really know. I've had students tell me mothballs smell terrible when I use this example before, but I don't think I've ever smelled a mothball, so anyway, I hear they smell terrible. But maybe your grandmother's house smells like mothballs. So you learn the association between going to see your grandmother and the smell of mothballs. After enough time passes, the smell of mothballs alone will be enough to give you a pleasurable feeling. And my students say, oh no, mothballs smell terrible, so maybe I should change this to like apple pie or whatever your grandmother's house smelled like. If you have a good relationship, then it's natural to have spending time with them makes you feel good. Now you've associated whatever her house smelled like with visiting with her, and now that smell will make you happy. You know, sometimes smells like perfume or cologne that people wear or things like that, they bring back pleasurable memories, they make us feel good, right? Operant conditioning, as we said, was just all about whatever behavior you choose to do being reinforced or punished. Like, for example, playing with a child of another race. So if your parents treated this positively and rewarded you for it, praised you for it, reinforced you for it, then you'll be more likely to do that again in the future. And you'll be more likely to feel positively about individuals of another race and about spending time with them. If your parents punish you or obviously show that they're not approving of that, then that makes you less likely to spend time with people of another race later, right? So you see here that our attitudes are changed by the reinforcements or the punishments that we received, okay? And let me know if you have any questions about this, okay? So when we're talking about attitudes, we need to talk about the difference between explicit and implicit attitudes. So an explicit attitude is an attitude that we can consciously endorse and can easily report. So an explicit attitude is one that we know about. When we say consciously, we know about this attitude and we can tell other people about it. This is different from an implicit attitude, attitudes that are involuntary, uncontrollable, and at times unconscious. So we might not even be aware of it. Like, for example, I often ask when I teach this class with an in-person class, I say, how do you feel about math? And I have a large, very vocal part of the class say, oh, I hate math, and then I'll have a few people say, oh, I love math, right? That's an explicit attitude. You know that you feel that way. You tell me how you feel, right, out loud. An implicit attitude might be one that we're not really sure that we even have, or we don't really understand how we feel about something, right? And we'll talk more about implicit attitudes in a second, but the main difference here is it in our conscious awareness? Do we know that it's there? And we said that our attitudes come from our genetics, and we said that our attitudes come from our environment. The same can be true about both explicit and implicit attitudes. These attitudes that we don't even realize that we have can come from our environment, right, that maybe we've perhaps been reinforced or punished for in the past. We don't even realize it, though, but they can still influence our behavior. It says we have explicit and implicit attitudes about many things, not just different races. A lot of the research on implicit attitudes has focused on feelings about different races, trying to understand implicit racism. What they do, and we'll talk more about this later in the class when we talk about prejudice, but what they will do is they will flash different pictures of individuals of different races, and they will ask you to make some kind of determination very quickly. And so the idea is that if we don't give you enough time to think about it, then your implicit attitude will shine through. Now, there's a lot of problems with this kind of testing we'll talk more about later, but oftentimes people look into the implicit attitudes about races. But we have implicit attitudes about many things. So I told you guys a second ago that my students often explicitly say that they hate math. But when we do an implicit test specific to how they feel about math, typically people who explicitly say they hate math implicitly feel okay about math. I'm not saying they secretly love it, but they might not realize that they don't feel as negatively about it as they think they do. Maybe perhaps when you tell your friend that you hate math, then they say, yeah, I hate math too, and you can kind of bond over that. And so we kind of internalize that, I hate math. And maybe especially in women, because we do have a stereotype. And I don't remember if I told you guys in this class, but there was a Barbie back in the day that said, I hate math, math is hard, and so maybe we've taught people to feel this way about math, but secretly they don't really feel that way as strongly as they think they do. And this test that I was telling you about is the implicit attitudes test, right? Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about is changing attitudes. This is just a little bit to help transition us into persuasion as we talk about persuasion next week. But we already talked about this when we talked about cognitive dissonance. It says when people experience dissonance, their image is threatened. So remember that cognitive dissonance happens when our behaviors and our beliefs are not lining up. And we can either change our belief, change our behavior, or keep them both and add some kind of justification here and add some new thought. So we've already talked about this, and we gave the example when we were talking about the research study about telling a lie and how much do you have to be paid to feel okay about telling a lie. It says when we cannot explain our behavior with an external justification, it often leads to an internal justification, right? So we said that with the example about telling a lie, the people who got paid $20 said, I've got a sufficient external justification for telling a lie, so I don't have to change my belief. The task was terrible, but it's okay because I got paid $20 to lie. The other people only got paid $1 to lie. That didn't feel like enough money. They didn't want to think that they told a lie for $1, so they convinced themselves that they actually liked the task when they didn't. So why am I reviewing this here? Because that's an attitude change. They had an evaluation about the task, that the task was boring, but that evaluation was changed based on the situation, about them feeling maybe perhaps guilty for telling a lie. It changed their attitude. So I said that to reduce dissonance, we can either change the behavior or change the belief. Here we're focusing on that when we're talking about reducing dissonance by changing something about ourselves and perhaps changing the way that we feel about something. So you can use cognitive dissonance to your advantage as you try to persuade people and change their attitudes. So we will talk more about persuasion next week. This is where I'm going to leave off this week. If you have any questions, let me know. Remember that I do have office hours on Monday, so come by if you have any questions. And don't forget about the activity for this week.